All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Lin. I'm an assistant professor of international studies here at the University of Washington. Welcome to the next event in our book series for the Taiwan Studies program. We're very honored to have this afternoon Professor Timothy Young, who will be giving a talk on his book that was just recently published in paperback edition, Medicated Empire, the Pharmaceutical Industry and Modern Japan. So let me give a quick introduction to Professor Young. Tim Young is Associate Professor in the Department of History and the Director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Georgia. He specializes in the cultural and socioeconomic history of modern Japan, as well as Japan's relationship to Asia and the rest of the world. His current research focuses on the politics of agriculture, environment, and capitalism in post-World War II Japan through the re-examination of land reform during the Allied occupation. So he'll be talking today about his first book, which is published by Cornell University Press in 2011 and was co-awarded the 2022 Hagley Prize in Business History. Professor Young holds an AB, did his undergraduate at Dartmouth College, and his PhD from Columbia University. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Young.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you to everybody at the University of Washington's Jackson School Taiwan Studies program. It's really a phenomenal program, I think, and I think everybody here is doing such a great job of running it and advocating for Taiwan studies. So really, I'm honored to be here. And what I'll talk about today is a bit of my book in relationship to colonial Taiwan. So the title of the talk is Colonial Taiwan and the Nature of Japan's Pharmaceutical Industry. So without further ado, I'll just begin. Japan's pharmaceutical industry, like its global counterparts in the early 20th century, developed as a colonial enterprise. And that's a sub-argument of this book, which James said is coming out in paperback this month. So it's a bit of a book launch of sorts. So thank you for that. And the book itself is a business history that intervenes into the social and cultural history of medicine in East Asia. And it focuses specifically on one company, that is Hoshi Pharmaceuticals, you see here, a company that had its heyday in the early to mid 20th century when it achieved spectacular successes and equally spectacular failures. Hoshi was once among Japan's leading drug firms, along with names like Takeda, Shionogi, and Sankyo, which continue to be among the leading firms in Japan's industry today. And like these companies, its prosperity was deeply intertwined with the fortunes of Japan's colonial empire. And for Hoshi, there was no more important colony than Taiwan, which was won, as we know, as a spoil of war in 1895 after Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War. Hoshi depended on Taiwan as a reservoir for medicinal resources and as a market for consumer goods. Taiwan was the company's largest overseas market for its patent medicines, its primary source of crude morphine, and the location of company-managed plantations producing quinine and cocaine. Japan's colonial regime in Taiwan, in turn, relied on Hoshi to help advance its health and hygiene programs, particularly its efforts to gradually suppress the problem of opium addiction through a state-run opium monopoly. So combining global histories of business, medicine, and empire, this talk shows how the pharmaceutical industry simultaneously supported, yet in very important ways, also subverted Japan's imperial mission in Taiwan. Now, in some ways, the history of medicine in colonial Taiwan and perhaps Japan's empire more broadly begins with this man here, and that is Goto Shinpei. Although, of course, this is a major exaggeration, I'm not a fan of the great man history narrative. Goto, of course, was a larger-than-life figure with an outsized influence. And importantly, Goto himself was a medical doctor. He had trained at Fukushima Sukugawa Medical School, worked as a resident physician at Aichi Prefectural Hospital, and studied abroad in Germany at the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin. Goto was a prolific writer whose works on medicine and public hygiene, such as Eisei Seidoron, that's on sanitary administration, 1890, had outlined the principles of Japanese state medicine based on Western and particularly German forms. Goto brought his ideas on medicine and public health to Taiwan when he assumed the position of head of civil affairs under Governor General Kodama Gentaro. Now, medicine to Goto and his ilk had a disciplinary function, and the disciplinary function of medicine for colonial rule relied in part on medicine's rhetorical power. For example, in an off-cited 1901 speech, Goto had this to say, quote unquote, "Other imperial nations use religion to help them govern, exploiting weaknesses in humanity. They proselytize to unify people's hearts and minds, ridding them of superstition. Because we do not have an absolute religion, our nation recognizes that relieving humanity from the suffering of disease is a similar method for unifying." That's a lot to unpack there. I'll go through that. For Goto, Taiwan was his laboratory, where he was quick to implement the fundamentals of Meiji state-era medicine, including the so-called sanitary police and quarantine, as well as public hospitals and sewers. Now, one of Goto's proteges was this man here, Hoshi Hajime, who founded the pharmaceutical company in his name. Hoshi first met Goto when the former, that is Hoshi, was the editor and publisher of Japan and America, which was a turn-of-the-century newspaper for introducing the two nations' business and commercial elites. Both men had ties to Fukushima Prefecture and became fast friends. Hoshi's connections to Goto, as well as to people within Goto's orbit, such as Sugimura Shigemaru and Nitobe Inazo, afforded him privileged access to Taiwan's government general, which was essential for the making of his pharmaceutical company. Now, Hoshi Pharmaceuticals made its early fame and fortune selling patent medicines, or baiyaku, which might be considered as over-the-counters today. Hoshi's initial interest in medicines came from his time in America when, in the words of his official biographer, he quote-unquote vowed to not get sick, and in order to take care of himself when he felt the slightest onset of a cold, he purchased a variety of patent medicines to take. Patent medicines in Japan at this time had similar social resonances to counterparts in Europe and the United States. That is, how they were sold often mattered more than the contents of the medicines themselves. Elites often rallied against the quackery of patent medicines and decried how amoral purveyors preyed on and profited from the fears of an uneducated populace. And there was no more vocal critic than this man here, and that was Fukuzawa Yukichi. Fukuzawa wrote a series of essays from 1878 through 1883 that denounced patent medicines as unscientific placebos that duped the public at best and poisoned it at worst. Fukuzawa and his supporters successfully lobbied for a flat 10% stamp tax on the retail price of every patent medicine sold, which was put into place in 1882. This was the same tax on substances at that time, which were deemed, quote unquote, unnecessary for daily life, like tobacco and alcohol. Yet, despite top-down regulations and rhetoric aimed at driving them out of existence, patent medicines nevertheless continued to thrive well into the 20th century. One of the major reasons was that firms like Hoshi transformed patent medicines from quack remedies to what they called so-called family medicines, kateyaku, both literally and in the cultural zeitgeist. In their hands, patent medicines became scientific objects of a democratic self-medication that were supplemental rather than oppositional to modern professional medical treatments, which patent medicine makers characterized as costly and out of reach for so many. Patent medicine makers positioned their products as a defense of the so-called common people, particularly in the rural hinterlands where medical care was scarce. Another major reason why this industry continued to thrive was the ability of producers to find markets abroad, and particularly to exploit a colonial exception. In 1905, the government amended its regulations on patent medicines to state that medicines exported outside of the Japanese home islands were outside of the purview of the stamp tax. Taiwan was Hoshi's most important market outside of Japan proper, where the company simultaneously developed its presence as it solidified its domestic growth. Other companies with a notable presence in Taiwan included Tsumura Juntendo, famous for Chujoto, which promoted female reproductive health, and Morishita, Taiwan's medicinal marketplace in 1913, only 2 years after it incorporated as a joint stock company, it established its first overseas branch office in Taihoku, or Taipei. In May of that year, the official colonial government-sponsored newspaper in Taiwan, that is Taiwan Nichi Shinpo, interviewed the company's president, titled "Civilized Nations and Patent Medicines." The interview sheds light on the company's marketing strategy, which blurred the lines between metropole and colony. The interview began with this rhetorical question: why are patent medicines so popular in civilized nations? Let me give you one example. Last night, cold in the morning, I had no appetite. This pain, which I would have had to endure for 3 or 4 hours, or perhaps for as long as one day, disappeared after only 1 hour by taking a dose of medicine that costs a mere 1. In this terribly competitive world, still stupid people who would not do something. In civilized nations, a simple dose of medicine would allow a man to be able to carry out daily tasks in his life. So, he would be back to normal and be able to cheerfully fulfill his duties. But in nations where medicine has not yet progressed, this headache can cause a lot of worry and negatively influence the functions of household and work. In our nation, in South Japan here, the average person spends 55 cents on patent medicines in a year. Although this has increased rapidly over the years, the average person in the United States, by comparison, 5 yen worth of patent medicine per year. In a few years' time, average consumption in our nation will increase from 1 yen to 2, then to 3, until it the level of the United States. In the interview, Hoshi basically aligns the consumption of medicine with the drumbeat of industrial capital. Time equals money. In a globally competitive modern world, civilized people took medicines because they could not afford to. They expressed civilization as productivity in teleological terms, with statistics on patent medicine consumption as the abstract measure. The individual shouldered the burden of health and welfare. The health of a properly functioning society depended on each individual, and each individual illness needs to be contained before it could disrupt the harmony of the home, the productivity of the workplace, and by extension, the unity of a nation-state empire striving to become the Western imperial. The individual had the freedom to not only diagnose his own ailment, but also to precisely choose what medicine without wasting more money. Again, time equals money, and Benjamin Franklin said that. Although Hoshi's interview took place in Taiwan, his orders also ranked for conditions within Japan. Hoshi was latching prevailing disciplines of uneven development, both within Japan proper, appendages, as well as abroad. Striking to me is that in 1913, which was the same year as the aforementioned interview seen here, the prevalence of patent medicine in Taiwan was exactly the same as within Japan proper. Now, this is an example of an advertisement in Taiwan from the 1925 issue of the Taiwan Nichi. It's a full-page advertisement, the first infomercial today that attempts to cultivate and educate consumers on how to use its medicine. Advice columns at the top concerning home remedies, and it lists popular Hoshi-based medicines like Hoshi medicine that quote unquote had to know about, had to have on hand. It also included tips about how best to use Hoshi medicines. Oops, sorry. The bottom half of the page introduces some of the more popular medicines that the company sold in Taiwan. With there is no limit to when adjusted. The company employed similar tropes and had similar tactics when marketing its medicines in both metropole and in formal colonies. One, the market included a burgeoning number of colonists, as well as of subverted colonies. For settler colonies abroad, consumption emphasized ties to the homeland. For colonized states, consumption helped the Pan-Asian society. And both consumption helped consolidate what it meant to be Japanese, at least in the hands of Hoshi. That is modern, scientific, and cosmopolitan. Hoshi thus defined quote-unquote Japaneseness as the universal standard for a hygienic life. Move on, and this is an example of an advertisement actually from colonial Korea, from the state's newspaper, from based on the ideas of consumption as longing. There are similar tropes deployed in Hoshi's ads in colonial Taiwan, but none were really as visceral and evocative as this shown here. It is an ad for adjusted medicine, which was far and away Hoshi's most popular. The text reads, this is in Japanese, you and I, we have the same hairstyle, the same features, you and I are alike. We wear the same kimono, the same waistband. You and I are alike. We have the same illnesses, bellyache, and I are alike. We have the same digestive organs, same medicine. We use the same medicine, you and I are alike. Now the images of the two women dress alike and look like play on the notion of sister. The sisters might be literal sisters, perhaps separated by the between metropole and colony. They might also be metaphorical sisters, one Japanese and one Korean, representing Pan-Asian unity, or they might be lovers. The image is potentially vague, but no matter the audience, the idea remains the same. The concept of Hoshi adjusted medicine is a marker of identification and belonging. So in this sense, Hoshi Pharmaceuticals and Burns is called a quote shared corporality in the marketing of women's medicines across Japan's empire, which emphasized cosmopolitanism, nativism under the banner of science and progress. Hoshi's advertisement promoted the similarity of all women's bodies based on the ability to consume the same commodity, the same ailments that women suffer. The company notably did not change its product labels, whether it sold them within the home islands or after the book was first published. I actually found this same ad in the Chugoku Shinbun, that is Chugoku, Western region in Japan, not China. Actually published in the same year of 1924. Many Hoshi's medicines, including the digestive medicine seen here, included both readers, legible to Chinese readers, as well as Korean script. Prices denominated in yen remain the same in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Consumers were able to purchase Hoshi branded products. Hoshi licensed merchants who operated within its franchise distribution network. The company tried to ensure that each franchise drugstore would promote an open and liberating environment that fostered a sense of freedom for consumers to choose their own medicine. In this sense, the idea was to eliminate the intimidating authority of the store clerk. And this would, of course, facilitate ever faster and more efficient sales. She put a lot of effort into training its store clerks to be friendly and approachable, and into educating them on the latest advances in medical science. Notably, had a preference, decided preference for female store clerks, though certainly not managers, which the company saw as more empathetic and approachable, particularly because the company saw its primary consumer as the Russian housewife who guarded the family's health. Now, this is one example of a full-page advertisement from the Chinese version of the Taiwan Nichi the Taiwan Xinhua, which describes a chain store convention in Taiwan for Hoshi franchisees. And to zoom here on the text, it reads, translation, a gathering of several hundred frogmen, franchise convention at the Taiwan Railway Hotel, unprecedented grand occasion in the pharmaceutical world. On, Hoshi, of course, also depended on colonies like Taiwan for medicinal resources, and it was no more important resource for the company than opium. And here again is the importance of Taiwan. In the 19th and 20th centuries, opium was the most notorious medicine in the history of East Asia, associated with addiction and vice, not to mention the fall of empires. Opium was deemed by Japanese authorities as too dangerous for public consumption. To them, the overriding war against drugs was the 1839 to 1842 Opium War, which forced Asia open to Western imperialism and transformed China into the so-called sick man of Asia. Although authorities recognized opium's indispensable analgesic properties, opium's potential danger to safety and morality took precedence to authorities over its supposed medicinal benefits. Yet what's important here is that the rules were not uniform across nation and empire, and they did not uniformly apply. Within Japan's home islands, authorities prohibited the private sale, possession, and use of opium and its derivatives. Yet such prohibitions only pertain to Japanese nationals in Japan's overseas colonies. The government generals of Taiwan and Korea, as well as the puppet state of Manchukuo in Manchuria in the 1930s and 40s, they actually administered state opium monopolies for the manufacture and sale of opium for both medicinal and recreational purposes. In the early 20th century, Hoshi Pharmaceuticals was Asia's leading private manufacturer of opium-based derivatives such as morphine, which was almost entirely due to its connections. Through its connections to officials in the government general of Taiwan, the company contracted Turkish poppy farmers to supply state-owned opium refineries in Taiwan. And these refineries were part of a top-down colonial policy that attempted to wean Taiwanese from opium addiction by first registering addicts and then requiring them all to purchase their opium through an exclusive state monopoly, through exclusive state vendors. So in the colonies, Japanese authorities actually permitted recreational opium smoking for the colonized. According to the aforementioned Goto Shinpei, who was the brain behind this policy, gradual suppression by means of a government monopoly was practical and humane, right? For two reasons. First, it was practical because it was profitable. In 1895, for example, authorities estimated that the opium monopoly could earn over 2 million yen per year from the regulated sale of opium. It was equivalent to roughly a third of the yearly fiscal budget management of Taiwan at the turn of the 20th century. After all, Japan's empire, as Dub's own historian Mark Metzger notes, quote unquote, suffered from a persistent capital shortage and went into debt to European American capitalists in order to build its European-style empire. Second, it was humane, again in quotes, because authorities saw opium smoking as a uniquely Chinese vice to which they were, quote unquote, innately predisposed. This was a widespread belief among Japanese authorities at this time. In the words of the historian Hoshi Yosaburo, quote unquote, when Formosa came into our possession, it was more difficult to decide what was the best course to pursue in regard to the opium smoking in the island that many, even the most eminent statesmen, were at their wits' end. I generally believe that the success of our administration in the island depended upon the ability of our authorities to solve this problem. To attempt, however, to make a most Chinese give up opium smoking would be like attempting to make them stop eating and drinking. Oh my God. Rather than submit to such an order to go back to China, unquote. Extraordinarily racist at that time, but that was normal discourse, right? Among Hoshi Pharmaceuticals purchased leftover crude morphine from the Taiwan opium monopoly at a steep discount to find the medical grade morphine for distribution in Japan and across the world. Hoshi was the sole private supplier of the drug within Japan during World War One, and the price of morphine, like almost all other medicines, skyrocketed due to an embargo on German goods. In 1916, Hoshi's monopoly over opium actually became the subject of controversy within the Japanese national diet. At the time, a diet member and also a medical doctor named Tsuchiya Seisaburo was concerned with the price of opium-based medicines. And he had questioned why Hoshi was the only company that had an official contract with Taiwan's government general, and why other companies were not allowed to compete. This spurred a revision of Japan's opium laws to allow three other pharmaceutical firms at that time. They were Sankyo, Dainippon, and to enter into government contracts to purchase crude morphine in order to manufacture opium-based narcotics. Hoshi's commitment to Taiwan, however, also attracted international attention. During a global anti-narcotics movement in the early 20th century, Japan's opium trade often fell under suspicion, particularly as its empire expanded in Asia. And attention, of course, focused on Japan's rather unique opium policies as colonies, and particularly in colonial Taiwan. To critics, the government general's opium policy was hypocritical. They claimed that its purpose was not to cure Taiwanese of the scourge of opium, but rather to monopolize its supply and demand in order to increase revenue for the state. And one of the most trenchant criticisms was how the government general sold opium paste in three different classes, from a top quality first grade opium paste meant for wealthy connoisseurs to the relatively inexpensive third grade paste supposedly meant for everyday addicts of lesser means. Now, if the goal had been to eradicate opium, the question then remained: why would authorities sell opium then to meet different consumer tastes at different price points? Critics tried to find a link between the illicit trade of opium in China and the manufacture of opium intended for legitimate medical use. And in the early 1920s, they pinpointed their suspicions to Hoshi Pharmaceuticals. Now, this is a diplomatic cable, a British diplomatic cable, right? So it's really quite amusing. You'd say, even not be the right word, hypocritical is like the better word, that it's a British diplomat saying this, knowing Britain's involvement in the opium trade. But here, just to say, morphia sold to Hoshi Drug Company, who professed to export it to Japan for medicinal purposes, is really exported secretly to China because the official figures showing the amount of drugs exported to Japan are not sufficiently large to cover the amount of morphia which is admittedly handed over to the Hoshi. In May of 1925, Hoshi Hajime and his company became embroiled in an opium trading scandal in which Hoshi was accused of illegally selling and distributing crude morphine intended for opium traffickers in China and the Soviet Union. Although the company ultimately escaped punishment, the incident had caused substantial damage. During the 2-year-long investigation and trial, the company's bank accounts were frozen, its financial credit was lost, and Hoshi Hajime's reputation was shattered. These financial difficulties led the company to bankruptcy in the 1930s, from which it never truly recovered. Now, Taiwan's government general, in turn, received blowback from Hoshi's opium scandal. And much of this actually emanated from within Taiwan itself, where anti-colonial colonized elites in the 1920s, similar to colonized elites throughout the world in the wake of World War I, challenged the legitimacy of Japan's civilizing mission. In Taiwan, as elsewhere, that civilizing mission had been couched in scientific metaphors of fitness, hygiene, and disease. For example, this is an editorial seen here in the Chinese language Taiwan Minbao from November 8th of 1925. The title translates as "The Pernicious Influence of Taiwan's Opium Policy and the Need to Promptly Implement Opium Prohibition." The editorial criticizes officials for the hypocritical and unscrupulous actions, which at best have turned a very blind eye to Hoshi's illicit actions in order to quote unquote sacrifice the people for profit, unquote. To the writer, Hoshi's scandal was proof that the opium monopoly needed to end and opium smoking needed to be completely banned, quote unquote, lest these immoral acts wreak havoc on the discipline of government officials, or even worse, court worldwide suspicion. The logic was that if the Japanese Empire had used the rhetoric of opium smoking as backward vice to differentiate civilized from uncivilized and thereby legitimate colonial rule, then why were so many within the colonial regime also profiting from the opium trade? In this sense, perhaps the true scandal of opium was the colonial exception in the state's opium policy, in which the Japanese state served simultaneously as both a medical doctor and really a drug dealer. Now moving on, Taiwan was also important to Hoshi for another medicinal resource, and that was cinchona, which was the raw material for the antimalarial drug. In the early 20th century, 90% of the world's supply of quinine was controlled by a Dutch cartel, which was problematic for many nations during the medicinal shortages of World War I. After that war, Hoshi was among several major Japanese pharmaceutical companies that attempted to manufacture Japan's own quinine through the control of their own resources with the support of the Japanese government. The company's attempt to grow cinchona in Taiwan formally began in 1922 in two plantations near these two Aboriginal villages seen here, one in Laisha in Kaohsiung Prefecture and the other in Ziban in Taidong Prefecture in the southeast of Taiwan. Yet planning for this project began as early as 1916 when the company sponsored a scientific expedition to Java, which included leading figures tropical medicine, and agriculture to investigate techniques for growing cinchona. Beginning in 1917, the company also began purchasing land in the upper regions of the Andes Mountains of Peru, which in the words of the historian Paul Gutenberg was quote unquote a key site in cocaine history, a source of crude cocaine, cinchona, and also of knowledge about this business. The company did all this with the help of the state-sponsored overseas industry company, that's in Japanese, the Kaigai Kogyo Kapsuki Gaisha, or KKKK, which funded immigration and economic expansion abroad, most notably in Latin America. And in subsequent years, the company transferred tools and knowledge, as well as seeds, saplings, and other organic material from its holdings in Peru to its plantations within Taiwan. By the late 1920s, however, Hoshi had largely abandoned its plantations in Taiwan due to the aforementioned opium scandal. But beginning in the early 1930s, the Japanese government stepped in to actually help the company revive those plantations when it worried once again about medicinal shortages as it waged its war campaigns in China and later into Southeast Asia. For the company, quinine in Taiwan was an opportunity to rescue its finances and reputation in the wake of the opium scandal. It was also a project intimately tied to the ways in which politicians, scientists, and colonial bureaucrats envisioned and tried to administer Taiwan as part of a self-sufficient and notably civilized humanitarian empire. Hoshi's plantations were joint ventures between the company, the Taiwan government general, university research centers, and the state-sponsored Taiwan Development. Competing drug firms of the time, like Takeda and Shionogi, had similar investments and schemes with tropical medicine research centers in Tokyo and Kyoto Imperial Universities, respectively. And notably, firms like the US pharmaceutical giant Merck controlled similar plantations and had similar projects in Guatemala and Costa Rica in the 1940s with the support of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Hoshi's project relied upon medical science and advances in modern science to overcome the problems of Taiwan's natural environment. In particular, the project depended on the expertise of Japan's leading scientists in tropical medicine and tropical agriculture, such as these two figures here, Hoshi Tsuguo, who was known as the father of modern medicine in Taiwan. That's a lot to unpack there. And Tanaka Chozaburo, a leading botanist from Taihoku Imperial University. These figures helped the company figure out how to overcome, supposedly, the harshness of Taiwan's tropical typhoon environment in order to make it suitable for growing cinchona. They often traveled overseas in order to bring back the latest global knowledge about how to improve cinchona harvests and quinine. These scientists also notably provide the company with legitimating authority of science for its public relations campaigns. They claim that Hoshi's project would help resolve the problems of malarial infection, which was rampant in Taiwan. And they also celebrated Hoshi's project as a crucial stepping stone for opening up Taiwan's mountainous regions for industrial agriculture. The linchpin of the project, however, and perhaps its biggest selling point, was the emphasis on how to overcome Taiwan's so-called aboriginal problem. In very, very crude terms, the problem was a question of how do you manage these peoples who have been forced into the mountains so that they don't attack the colonial populations, to put the settler colonists at risk? Do you teach civilized ways of modern life, or do you subdue them through military means? So here, there are a number of ethnographers who studied and classified Aborigines with an aim towards assimilation. On the other hand, there are also several military campaigns that had marched into the mountains in order to quote-unquote discipline these tribes. Hoshi's answer was that the plantations would improve the welfare of these peoples by providing a so-called Japanese standard of living to the Aboriginal peoples through education in partial exchange for their land and labor. The company established schools on the premises and dispensed food and other basic necessities as enticements for regular attendance. The purpose of these schools was to educate in the methods of sustainable agriculture rather than what they saw as slash and burn agriculture. The company called these plantations so-called cooperative areas where Japanese, Taiwanese, and Aborigines would closely work together in so-called pan-Indian harmony. This is the time of the 1930s. It's important fact. As an aside, Hoshi Hajime originally claimed that he got his ideas on plantation management from visiting Native American residents in the United States with the aforementioned. We'll talk more about that later, I guess. Quinine production, like that of two extractive industries in colonial Taiwan, that is camphor and sugar, was tied to the colonial government's program of Aboriginal management. The government treated Taiwan's highlands as a special administrative zone, where, in the words of historian Paul Barclay, quote unquote, the state proceeded to inventory, catalog, regulate, regiment, spatially array, and even nurture indigenous populations in order to extract their wealth. So in this sense, Hoshi's proposal to cultivate cinchona was simply the latest successor in a long history of interconnections between business interests and government concerns. In practice, however, Hoshi's cinchona cultivation scheme faced several issues. The project actually fell into the red in 1938, only a few years after it had begun. And one of the major intractable problems was simply the climate, simply the environment. These are pictures from one of the plantations, and you can sort of see how the open landscape of the plantations on the left seabed is vulnerable to typhoons. This is what Taiwan is prone to. The problematic climate, in turn, intensified a more pressing problem that the plantations encountered, was insufficient and inadequate labor. According to a 1940 1942 company report, quote, because damage from the elements often occurred, there are times when all available labor power would be focused on repairing roads damaged by landslides, unquote. And growing cinchona was really done by hands, very, very labor intensive, right? It included removing weeds, clearing the land, harvesting crops, drying, peeling, storing cinchona bark, all this done with human labor power, right? All of it done by hand. A related problem was how to attract and motivate the laborers to work. Right? So according to the same company report, this is in 1942, the so-called aboriginals, that is those who live on these plantations, near these plantations, quote unquote, problematically had sufficient land to live off of, no desire for money, and therefore were unwilling to work for wages, right? So that's probably really only in the hands of the business manager, right? Not if you're a worker there, clearly, right? Aboriginal men earned 90 cents per day, while Taiwanese, the Hontojin, how it was classified, earned 130 cents per day. Aborigines were preferred to Taiwanese largely because of their lower wages. And in addition, women and children were employed at wages roughly 80% and 50% that of men. Now, one of the supposed solutions that Hoshi, as well as other companies, found was to use coolie laborers to work for 10 days at a time, at roughly 110 cents for the entire time period. Now, these coolie were recruited by applying to the local Aboriginal Management Office, which was run by the local government police. According to the 1943 master's thesis on plantations in Taiwan, because demand for coolie labor was so high, quote unquote, it was customary to give gifts like money and liquor to police officers to facilitate transactions. The writer adds that whichever way you look at it, obtaining labor was an underhanded process. So the point here is that in practice, the management of Hoshi's plantations was a very far cry from the fantasy of friendly cooperative paternalism. Production of a so-called life-saving medicine like quinine intimately involved the subjugation of human lives. And of course, no matter how hard Aborigines worked, the scarcity and high cost of quinine meant that they were almost always the last in line to receive quinine to prevent and treat malaria. Now, Hoshi's plantations only began producing viable yields of cinchona towards the end of World War II. By the end of the war, it actually expanded production to 4 other plantations here in this slide. But with the end of World War II and the Chinese nationalist takeover of Taiwan in 1949, property of Hoshi Pharmaceuticals, along with that of other Japanese drug companies, as well as that of all Japanese companies, um, they are taken by the state, and the drug companies are incorporated into state monopoly known as the Taiwan Medical Goods. So Hoshi Pharmaceuticals' quinine empire, in other words, had a post-colonial afterlife, both tangibly and also ideologically. So in conclusion, by highlighting Hoshi's connections to colonial Taiwan, I've really tried to show how the global pharmaceutical industry itself was fundamentally colonial. The company's connections to the government general in Taiwan was a major reason for the successes and failures of both. The often symbiotic relationship Hoshi had with the Japanese state and its imperial expansion linked medicine sales to disciplinary regimes as well as domestic and international political intrigues. Hoshi was far from alone in these various intrigues. And the point I try to make in the book is that Hoshi, in its heyday, although it was a company that failed, was really not all that different from other large-scale companies of its time, many of which remain the leading firms in the industry today. This was a time when pharmaceutical development did not depend so much on the controlled, sterile research laboratory, but on procuring and processing raw materials from far-flung and often colonized places. In this sense, This presentation has been about how colonial Taiwan was one of the most important colonized spaces for the emergence of Japan's pharmaceutical industry. Quite literally, its living laboratory. Yet the point I'm trying to make is that it's far from a controlled and sterile laboratory. It was a laboratory that depended on global connections and was prone to geopolitical, cultural, and socio-economic contaminations. So, thank you for your time. That's the end of the talk, and I've included here. I don't really like doing this, but the book, as James said, is just coming out in paperback. And this is the discount code. It's 40% off. It's quite a good deal, I should say. Although I should also note that most libraries have this in ebook form. So if you're interested, please feel free to read the book, but also look forward to your questions. And thank you so much for hosting me.